How much farther is it? Neil whined. I had to admit, I was getting a bit tired myself. When we first decided to go on a camping trip in the Great Smokies, I wasn't expecting it would be this far. According to the map, we're almost there, Jean said. You mean the map that covers the entire state? Sharon said. Almost there could be 100 miles. Jean whipped around on her. Do you think I'm that stupid? Of course, it's not a map of the whole state. I picked it up at the ranger station. It only covers the Tennessee section of the Great Smokies. He turned back and began trudging. Well, pardon me, O great map master, Sharon said under her breath. Jean paused for a moment, then kept going. I knew he had heard her and wanted to chew her out, but with all that had happened, my thoughts were interrupted by the sounds of struggling behind me. Turning, I found Mike wrestling with his backpack. It had gotten caught in between two small trees and had him stuck fast. Hold on there, bud, I said, trying to get down to him without getting my pack caught. Grabbing trees as I went, I worked my way down and got his pack unstuck. Thanks, man, he said, sweat pouring off him, as if this trip wasn't tough enough. I hear ya, I said. You need to take a break for a minute. Yeah, he said, dropping to the ground. I chuckled, seeing the smallest of the group panting like a dog in the middle of summer. Hold on here, I'll be right back. I struggled my way back up the hill only to find the rest of the group hadn't stopped when I did. I couldn't even see them. I ran for a little bit on what I thought was the trail, but didn't see any sign. Finally, in frustration, I stopped and let out a yell. Jean, Sharon, Neil, where are ya? I heard the words echo back to me, but that was it. There was no answering call, no sound of brush being pushed aside as they came back to me. There was nothing. Even the animals didn't seem to be very talkative. It was quieter than it had been the entire trip. Part of that was surely the lack of Neil whining and Sharon and Jean being at each other's throats. I wish those two would just give up and go get a room. Everybody knew they'd had it for each other bad, but they didn't seem to get it. Or maybe they did, and this is their idea of foreplay. Either way, I was a city boy lost in the middle of the forest. Jean had the map, and I had never been taught anything about direction or survival. I just came on this trip to hang out with my friends. A motel room in Gatlinburg, 5 friends catching some shows, shopping in Pigeon Forge. That was what I was here for. It was Jean's brilliant idea to go on this stupid camping trip. Even though he said he got the map at the ranger station, I knew he didn't listen to anything they said about which trail to go on. Jean was always the leader. He would have shooed them off and said he knew exactly where to go, even if he had no idea. Maybe I'm starting to see why Sharon hasn't hooked up with him yet. Maybe she's trying to knock him down a peg or two before he's ready to be civil. It had been 5 minutes since I had stopped and yelled, Jean, Sharon, Neil, I called again, louder this time. The only thing that got me was a louder echo coming back to me. I looked back at where I'd come from, only I wasn't sure of the exact direction. Jean had led us off the trail a while back, and I wasn't positive where I had left Mike. The dense canopy of trees left a little of the sun peeking through, still high in the sky. At least I'd have daylight for a while. Turning back the way I thought I'd come, I started back toward Mike. At least if we were together, there'd be 2 of us to find instead of having to search for another. It was a long walk. It seemed like I got to where I was a lot faster than I got back. I suppose trying to catch up with the people who know where they're going will get your feet moving faster. It wasn't long until I realized I'd been walking too far. I had somehow missed where Mike was. Mike, where are ya? I called, once again hearing the echo and nothing else. Looking around, I was sure this was where I'd left him. The trees all looked familiar. But then again, I didn't know how many millions of trees there were in the Smoky Mountains. There could be hundreds or even thousands of spots that looked exactly like this one. I began to question the wisdom, or lack thereof, of only one person having a map. A thought struck me. I whipped out my phone and tapped on the Maps app. Surely it could at least tell me where I am. Those hopes crashed and burned when I saw the no signal at the top of the screen. Mike, I yelled louder, more to vent my frustration. I collapsed on the ground, feeling more exhausted and hopeless than I had in a long time. And then I heard it. A faint call carried on the wind. It sounded like it was miles away. Mike! I yelled again. I sat and listened, which was easy since the animals weren't making any noise. Again I heard the return call. I hopped up like a dog who'd heard its master's whistle. Taking a general guess at the direction I'd heard it, I began to march determinedly. It wasn't quite a run, but it was no stroll through the park either. The thought of no longer being lost, or at least not being lost alone, drove me forward. After a few minutes I called again, then waited for the answer. It came from the direction I was heading, but somehow seemed quieter, like he was moving away from me. I broke into a run. My heavy backpack flopped from side to side, nearly making me stumble. But I didn't care. I was getting closer. I could feel it. I never saw the tree roots sticking up just enough to catch my toe and send me tumbling. I woke to total darkness. Something big and heavy was pressing down on me. I panicked and tried to throw it off, but it had a tight grip on me. Thrashing all around, this thing held me with a death grip. I swung my arms trying to punch it. My legs flailed to get it off me, but it wasn't happening. It had me and it knew it. The most disconcerting part was how quiet this thing was. It didn't growl or snarl or anything, just held on to me like its life depended on it. Finally, my energy was spent. It had won. All I could do was lay there and wait for the inevitable. I waited and waited. Nothing happened. Maybe whatever it was, I had fallen asleep. I couldn't imagine all my thrashing around wouldn't have woken it up. I rubbed at my shoulder, which was now sore from the fight with my unknown assailant. As I did, my fingers brushed up against the thing that held me. Out of curiosity, I rubbed it where it held me. I immediately pitched a fit at my stupidity. It was my backpack. My head thumped off the ground in frustration at how stupid I had been. Slowly, I unsnapped the latch that held the straps together and pulled my arms out. It was a huge weight off my shoulders when the pack rolled onto the ground. I lay there for a moment, having forgotten how dark it was when I was fighting to the death with my backpack. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my cell phone and turned on the flashlight. As I was doing it, I saw the no signal was still at the top of the screen. I wondered if there would be any signal until I got out of this godforsaken place. I shone the light around and pieced together how I'd gotten here, lying in a ditch, in the dark, in the forest. When I fell, I must have hit my head on the rock I saw in the ditch that had a small patch of dark red on it. I reached up to feel my head and found a tender spot. That'd do it, I said of my unscheduled nap. Checking the rest of me out with the flashlight, I found no other injuries. There remained the original problem of being lost and alone. At least the animals were making noise again. That was somewhat comforting. Having evaluated myself, I shone the light around the area trying to find out where I was. The answer was simple and frustrating. I was lost in the forest, surrounded by trees. Letting out a sigh, I dug through my backpack and found some granola bars and a couple of bottles of water. Hunger pangs hit me in the gut like a line drive. I ripped open a bar and devoured it. Before I knew it, 3 of them were gone, followed by a bottle of water chugged like I was in the middle of the desert. As I was enjoying my feast, the animal noises stopped. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end to hear such sudden and complete silence. Swallowing my last mouthful of water was so loud it nearly made me jump. As my light drifted aimlessly, suddenly I saw a pair of eyes glowing just inside the tree line. They glowed an eerie shade of yellow. I tried to remember if that meant it was a predator. Unfortunately, something in the back of my mind told me the silence was already telling me it was a predator. Whatever it was strangely seemed to have no fur. Its gray skin made it look like no animal I'd ever seen. If anything, it reminded me of Gollum from Lord of the Rings. It was on all 4s, but the front legs looked like arms. If I didn't know better, I would have said it was a child lost in the woods. But this was no innocent child. It crept toward me in a way that assured me it was hunting and nothing else. Nothing about the way it moved said, helpless to me. I unzipped my pack and reached down to the bottom, all the while, the predator creeping closer. "Come on," I said through gritted teeth, knowing it was down here as I moved things from one side of the pack to the other. It was getting worrisomely close now. One good leap and it would be within striking distance. I went for broke and dumped out the contents of the pack, hearing a loud thump hit the ground. I flashed around with my light and found what I'd been looking for. My Glock. I grabbed it and pointed where the predator had been, fully expecting it to be right in my face. But it was gone. Whipping all around, I searched with the light. gun trained on whatever I saw, hoping to catch a glimpse before it was too late. After a quick scan, I slowly panned around in a circle, searching more diligently for the creature, but there was nothing. Wanting to breathe a sigh of relief, but knowing it could easily be hiding behind any tree, I started picking up my belongings and stuffing them back into the backpack. As I did, the animals began making noise again. It was somewhat comforting to think that thing had left the area, but I didn't trust it. Once my backpack was repacked, I sat down and leaned on it like a pillow, with my back to the edge of the ditch and my phone's flashlight shining toward the trees. My gun sat on my lap ready for some quick action. It wasn't long till my eyes betrayed me, slowly closing, causing me to shake myself awake. Over and over, this played out with me struggling harder to stay awake than when I was sitting in church. My phone told me it was after 4 in the morning. The sun would be coming up in a couple of hours. Then I could continue the search for my friends. My phone also told me it only had 23% battery left. I held a major debate in my head: keep the light on and lose the ability to use my phone if and when I get a signal, or turn the light off and save my battery, leaving me at the mercy of that creature. It was an impossible choice until I remembered the animals in the woods were making noises. They were silent when the creature was around. My only question was, do they shut up just for that creature, or for all large predators? For the life of me, I couldn't remember. I took one last look around before powering off my phone. Leaning against the pack, my fight to stay alert continued. Each time my eyes snapped open, the sky was a lighter shade of gray. Soon I could see vague outlines of trees looming over me, not frightening or disconcerting at all. At last I lost the battle and fell into a deep, blissful sleep. I woke to the feeling of sandpaper on my face. Opening my eyes and seeing a deer licking my cheek made me nearly lose my mind. I jumped back, slipping off my pack and falling against the dirt in the ditch. The deer lost its mind as well. It jumped up and galloped away like a herd of hunters were hot on its heels. Once my heart was beating at a regular rate, I looked around at the brightly lit forest. It was late morning and I was still alive. The creature had not come back to kill me in my sleep. I took that as a good sign. Standing and stretching, I tried to figure out how I was getting out of there, let alone how I would find my friends. Shouting was out of the question now. I was sure that creature would see it as a sign of weakness and come running, like someone had rung the dinner bell. But how would I find which way I was going before I fell into the ditch? As I stood there and looked back at the trail, I saw the branch sticking up that had caused this whole debacle. I drew an invisible line from where I was standing to the branch. I then followed the line through me and extended it past me towards where I was heading. Looking up to the mountain looming above the trees, I tried to find a landmark to head towards. There was a huge rock that jutted out from the mountain with no trees around it. That was my focal point. I would use that as my compass. Speaking of compasses, I looked to the right and saw the sun rising into the late morning sky. With the sun in the east, I turned back towards my rock and calculated that it was more or less to the north. Having figured out where I was going, I kicked my feet into gear and started getting there. It was a no-brainer that my friends would be worried sick. They were probably already back at the motel making all kinds of calls and organizing a search party. I chuckled at my joke. I knew they were as helpless as I was in the woods. Gene pretended to know what he was doing, but truth be told, he was the worst of the group, mostly because he was too stubborn to listen to anyone else's directions. What if they ran into that creature? The thought froze me in my tracks. That thing looked like it wanted to have me for dinner. Running into the 4 of them would be like a smorgasbord. I shook the thought away. There was nothing I could do about it anyway. But my cheerful skip in my step at having determined a direction was gone. It was replaced by concern for my friends. As I walked, I thought about Mike. How excited he was to come along and see the Dixie Stampede for the first time. About Sharon and Gene. What a horrible couple they would make and how they fought all the time now when they were just friends. Or were they? I'd seen them sneaking little looks at each other when the group was together. Could the whole thing be a ruse? Could they be a couple already and trying to keep it a secret? And then there was Neil. I had no idea why I was friends with Neil. He was one of those people who just started tagging along one day. Before you knew it, they were part of the group. Neil was always competing with Gene to lead the group, but he went about it a different way. He would whine and complain until he got his way. Not all the time, but whenever there was something he left strongly about. Neil didn't want to come on this trip, and honestly, I think we all would have been happier if he hadn't. Being alone with my thoughts had me making good time toward my destination. The forest wasn't as dense here, and it was slightly downhill. Good walking conditions. The walk was going so well that I nearly started whistling. I squashed that real quick. I didn't need any additional noise for the creature to track. As it was, I would turn and look over my shoulder from time to time, just to be sure no one or nothing was following. Each time I glanced over my shoulder, the sky behind me seemed to get darker. The sun soon disappeared, and I could no longer deny it. There was a storm coming. I was stuck. There was no shelter except for trees, and rain leaks through them eventually. Even though I knew I would get caught out in the rain regardless, I stepped up my pace. Maybe there was a rock outcropping I could shelter under. As I walked, there was a blinding flash, followed by a deafening boom that knocked me to the ground. At first, I thought a bomb had gone off. I looked around and saw a tree burning on the mountain. It looked like some giant had ripped it in half. Staring at this apparition and wondering what the hell was going on, I saw another flash that lit up the clouds. This time the thunder was farther away, but still shook the ground. It was time to find that shelter before Mother Nature chose me as the target for her next lightning bolt. I ran toward the mountain as huge drops of rain pelted my back. It felt like I was getting hit by mini water balloons. It didn't take long for the rain to intensify, quickly becoming a deluge. The water came down so hard and fast that the ground didn't have time to soak it up. Since I wasn't on the trail anymore, I stumbled through puddles and mini bogs, struggling to stay on my feet as the muddy ground tried to swallow me whole. I held my hand above my eyes, trying to see where I was going, but the rain came down in sheets, reducing visibility to zero. Through it all, I kept trudging as straight as possible, hoping to find shelter. Without warning, I ran into something hard. It looked like I had reached the base of the mountain. I kept one hand on the rock face to guide me while trudging parallel to the mountain. Suddenly, nothing was pressing against my hand. I hadn't realized how much I'd been leaning on the rock until it wasn't there. I fell onto the surprisingly dry ground. Rolling over and looking up, I discovered I was in the mouth of a cave. I sat up and enjoyed watching the rain fall helplessly outside the cave, while I was safe inside from the fury of nature. After a short rest, I began to rub my arms to stave off the chill in the air. I took my backpack off and looked through for anything that would be helpful. Fortunately, I'd packed a sweatshirt. I took off my soaked t-shirt and used it for a towel before donning my warm, somewhat dry sweatshirt. While I was looking, I pulled out another granola bar and devoured it, then downed my last bottle of water. Staring at the empty bottle, I held it out to one of the streams of water falling from the sky until it was full. Putting the cap on, I noticed the water wasn't as clear as I would have liked, but I wasn't out of the woods yet, and I might need it somewhere down the road. I sat the pack down, leaning it against the side of the cave entrance, then pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The light penetrated only so far into the darkness. Even the diminished daylight could only illuminate so much. After that, it was like a shadow wall showing only a large black hole. I started into the inky blackness before I remembered and felt for the gun in my back waistband. I pulled it out and checked it, then dried it off and stuck it back in my waistband. I didn't see the need to have both of my hands occupied if I stumbled. I explored the first few feet of the cave, finding nothing spectacular, and was about to come back to my pack and sit out the rainstorm when I smelled something. It was faint at first, drawing me several steps further inside the cave before I could be sure. My mind had to be playing tricks on me because I swore I could smell a barbecue. My curiosity and growling stomach overrode common sense and drove me deeper into the cave. The light of the phone illuminated my steps as I carefully made my way towards the amazing smell of food. It wasn't long until there was a glow in front of me. A fire burned in the distance, just visible, bathing the cave walls in an orange glow. As the promise of a warm fire tantalized me, drawing me closer, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye that made my spine turn to ice. Coming from the far side of the fire was the creature that had stalked me the night before. At least it looked like the same creature. The eyes shone yellow in the fire's light. It walked on all fours and struck an amazing resemblance to Gollum from Lord of the Rings. I dosed my light and threw myself behind a rock that seemed big enough to conceal me. Straight ahead was the pinprick of light that was the cave mouth and the outside beyond it. Even if I wanted to, the creature would see me and hunt me down if I tried to escape while it was within sight. Daring to sneak a peek, I leaned around the rock to see if it was still there. What I saw horrified me. The creature was tending the fire, seemingly oblivious to my presence. It checked the pieces of meat that lay across hot rocks beside the fire. He took a few off and sat them aside. Then he walked toward the left wall and disappeared. I leaned out a little further to find out what he was up to, and wished I wouldn't have. Hanging from a large wooden frame, tied in a spread eagle, was a human male who had been skinned. The creature came up to him and carved several chunks of muscle with a large, primitive-looking knife. Once satisfied, he brought the pieces of meat back to the fire and laid them on the hot rocks where the cooked pieces of meat had been. He then took the pieces and disappeared into a hole in the wall. I threw myself behind the rock, breathing hard at the sudden realization. Oh my God, that thing killed someone and it's eating him. My stomach lurched at the thought. It took all I had to keep from vomiting on the spot. But I knew how loud I could get when I puked, and I had no desire to let that thing know I was here. I peeked around the corner again and didn't see it. My eyes were drawn to the dead body hanging there. For the first time, I noticed there was another body strung up beside him. It was another naked male, but he hadn't been skinned yet. 2 more bodies hung beside that one. 1 male, 1 female, both naked. Realization hit me like a sledgehammer as I realized the naked woman was Sharon. Looking again, I saw the men were Neil and Mike. No, I said, abandoning any semblance of subtlety and charging over to see my friends. When I got there and stood face to face with them, hot tears rolled down my cheeks. Their eyes were closed, and none of them moved a muscle. I went to them one by one and felt for a pulse just to be sure. I came to the one who had been skinned first. He had no pulse. My only guess was it was Gene. Next, I moved on to Mike. There was a scar on his neck and gore down the front of him. He also had no pulse. Neil was the same way, scar on his neck and no pulse. As I got to Sharon, I noticed something about her chest. It was moving. She didn't have a scar on her neck. I reached up to take her pulse and her eyes shot open. Instantly, she began to scream. I covered her mouth with my hand, but I knew it was too late. You need to be quiet and pretend you're dead, or I will be. You understand? I said, still holding her mouth. She nodded and I ran around behind them as I heard footsteps approach. I stood behind Gene since he was the biggest of our group, and put my hands and feet behind his, posing in the same spread eagle. My only hope was that it didn't notice me. I didn't dare move as I heard footsteps enter the room and come over to where we were. I stood as still as a statue. Only my eyes looked over to where Sharon was hanging. I saw the creature stand and look at her. She had lowered her head again, looking every bit asleep or dead. The creature poked her breast with the knife, drawing a few drops of blood, but she refused to move. And then another creature stepped up to her, and a third. They poked and prodded her to see if she was awake, but she wasn't moving. Panic grew inside me. How many of these things were there? If I knew it was just one, I would have already shot it. But if hundreds waited in the darkness of the cave's side rooms, there was no chance. My thoughts were interrupted when I heard sounds coming from them. It was like chittering insects communicating. They spoke back and forth while standing in front of Sharon, who still refused to move. As the argument became heated, I noticed one of the creatures looking in my direction. The longer I watched, the more I realized it wasn't looking in my direction. It was looking at me. It stepped around Sharon to the backside, when its eyes grew wide and it began to screech. The other two looked from it to where it was looking, and eventually found me. Their eyes narrowed as one came around in front of Jean's body, and the other stepped between Neil and Mike. The one holding the knife was closest when I gave up on my deception, drew my gun, and shot all three. The sound of the shots in a cave made me instantly deaf. The only thing I could hear was my ears ringing. I grabbed the knife off the ground and cut Sharon down. She collapsed like a bag of rocks. "We should go," I said. "What?" she said. "We should—" "Never mind," I said, picking her up and carrying her over my shoulders like a fireman. I struggled to carry her and hold the gun. She kept slipping off my shoulder and I would have to grab her to keep her on. The thing was, I was grabbing her naked behind every time. It wasn't like I had a choice or was enjoying it. If I didn't, she would fall off. As I ran, legs already starting to tremble, I felt a rock fly past my cheek. I looked back, and there were many more of the creatures running after us. I didn't have time to stop and aim, but I pointed toward the closest one and squeezed off a shot. By some miracle, the creature fell. I didn't know if I'd hit it, or the sound of the gun frightened it, causing it to fall. I had no chance to celebrate as the first rock hit me in the back of the head, nearly causing me to stumble, which would have been fatal. Instead, I pointed and fired another shot, hearing a most satisfying scream. The cave grew brighter as the mouth grew closer. Then suddenly, we were out. It wasn't a cause for celebration, though. I glanced back to see a horde of creatures following us out of the cave as well. So close, and yet so far. My legs weren't going to last much longer carrying her. I needed a break, and I needed it soon. I didn't think they would stop if I turned around and called a timeout. To punctuate that point, another rock hit me, this time on the back. I pointed and fired again in response, disappointed not to hear another scream. Finally, the inevitable moment came. I tripped. Sharon and I went head over heels in a tangled heap. By some miracle, I managed to hold on to my gun. I tried to jump up but ended up falling to the side, still aiming and shooting another creature. They tried to get around us, but I shot two more. Scrambling to my feet, I was able to aim better and shoot another. They still greatly outnumbered us. There were too many of them to count. I aimed at groups, hoping to get more than one kill at a time. They still tried to flank us, and I shot them as they did, but the inevitable moment finally came. My slide locked back. I instantly released it, just in case any of them knew what that meant. I continued to aim at them in a threatening way, and they held their distance, not wanting to be the next shot, but they had encircled us and were closing in. I looked at Sharon to say goodbye, but she wasn't looking at me. She had my phone and was doing something with it, hopefully calling for help, even though I knew no help would get here in time to save us. Staring into the nightmare faces of these bloodthirsty cannibals, I prayed a prayer of utter desperation. The first one was within reach when suddenly the most piercing sound came from behind me. Looking back, I saw Sharon holding my phone up with one hand and her ear with the other. I held my ears as well. The creatures tried to cover their ears but screamed in agony at the sound. As a group, they ran back to the cave, holding their ears as they went. I couldn't believe it. Turning to Sharon as she shut the alarm off, I smiled. "Well, aren't you clever?" I said. "Not clever enough," she said, looking at her naked body. "You think I could borrow your sweatshirt?" I chuckled as I took it off and gave it to her. "We should find a road and get out of here before they decide to come back," I said. As we walked, she explained what had happened, how the creatures had surrounded them, how they thought Mike and I had already been captured. "The funny thing was, Gene never gave up hope," she said. "He kept telling us to hold on, that you would find us, even when— Don't tell me he was still alive when they—" She slowly nodded. "I can still hear his screams," she said with a haunted look. "I don't think I'll ever forget that. I can't imagine. But even after they took his face, he still told us not to give up hope." Amazing. After walking a long time, constantly looking back every few minutes, we came to the greatest sight either of us could imagine. A road. Within an hour, a ranger came by and rescued us. It was the longest hour of our lives, keeping watch for cannibalistic creatures to jump out at the last second and drag us back to the cave. Our friends were never found. The ranger told us we were lucky to make it out alive. Many hikers go missing in the forest and are never seen again. I know Sharon and I never want to see another forest, unless we pass by it on the highway. I've guided people all over these mountains for years, but this time felt off from the start. We gathered at a cramped parking area beside a faded sign that no one had bothered to replace in decades. It warned about logging access only, like that mattered to the 3 strangers I'd agreed to take up here. I was already questioning my decision to lead them. We had Neil, who practically jumped at every snap of a twig, like he expected a bear or something worse to leap out any second. Then there was Lauren, lugging a huge camera bag, and a determination that told me she wasn't here for the usual scenic vistas. Ben rounded out the trio, older, a bit grizzled, ex-military maybe. He didn't talk much, but every so often he'd glance at the tree line like he was measuring how far we still had to go. That battered sign was the only thing hinting we were on an old trail at all. Park management quietly erased this route from maps years back, and nobody really explained why. I'd heard bits and pieces about unusual disappearances around here. Campers that never checked out. Travelers who parked their cars but never came back for them. Some folks in town said the forest didn't want them to, but I convinced myself that was local superstition. At least, that's what I told the group. I don't think any of us believed it. We started walking. The path sloped into dense undergrowth, the kind that muffles everything else around you. No birdsong, no wind in the branches, just heavy silence. Sometimes, it felt like even our breathing echoed. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder and catch Neil doing the same, eyes flicking from tree to tree. He claimed he saw a shape moving alongside us, but I saw nothing. Still, his unease got under my skin. A mile in, we found footprints that looped over each other, the tracks too messy to tell where they started or ended. Someone joked it was just an animal trail, but it didn't look right. It almost seemed like a single person had been pacing in circles, lost or waiting for something. Lauren snapped photos, close-ups of the footprints, the underbrush, a tree with deep scratches like someone tried to mark their way out. I noticed she stayed quiet after that, eyes darting to the hidden corners of the forest. By late afternoon, we stumbled across a rotted wooden post, half eaten by moss. A burnt spiral symbol had been scorched into its surface. It gave off a strange sense of warning. Nobody wanted to dwell on it too long, but I think all of us felt its significance without saying a word. We pressed on until dusk, lighting our headlamps in the gloom. The campsite we chose was basically a patch of level ground surrounded by leaning trees that seemed to bend in our direction. Every attempt at conversation petered out quickly, as if we were conserving energy for some unknown danger. Setting up our tents felt like a race against the dark, each rustle in the leaves prickling our nerves. That night, I tried to sleep. It was impossible to fully relax knowing there were who knows how many miles left ahead of us. Lauren kept her camera within reach, as if she expected to capture something lurking outside. Ben did this slow patrol around the tents, scanning the perimeter with a flashlight. Neil lay awake, eyes wide, focusing on the shapes dancing beyond the lantern light. I wouldn't have called it a restful evening. Every noise made us flinch. A whisper here, a crack of a branch there, too distant to be certain of anything, yet impossible to ignore. By the time morning light crept through the trees, I swear all of us felt like we'd been tested somehow. The forest was keeping silent about what else it held in store. Looking back, that first day should have been enough to turn around. But we pushed on, maybe from stubborn pride, maybe from a need to know what was drawing us deeper. Because when you sense a place doesn't want you there, it becomes nearly impossible to resist finding out why. That was only the beginning. We broke camp at first light, convinced that pressing deeper would somehow explain the bizarre symbols and footprints we kept finding. Part of me wanted to bolt back to the parking lot, but I guess we'd come too far. Maybe we were stubborn, or maybe each of us felt that gnawing curiosity, like we had to see how bad it could get. The terrain got rougher as we went. The trail wound around collapsed logs and thick undergrowth that snagged at our legs. Neil clung to the back of our group, eyes darting at every rustle. Lauren walked ahead, camera at the ready, determined to document each strange clue. Ben just marched in silence, jaw set tight. Every once in a while he'd whisper, "We're going the right way," though I couldn't tell if he was trying to convince us or himself. Eventually, we stumbled on the first cabin. It leaned at a weird angle against a tree trunk, like a drunk who'd just given up standing. Half the roof had caved in, letting sunlight filter through broken beams. But it was the door that stopped us in our tracks. That same twisted emblem scorched into the wood. Something about the way the char framed its spiral edges made my stomach lurch. Inside, the air felt clammy, and the floorboards sagged under our weight. Dust coated everything. An old table sat in the corner, collapsed on one side. A pile of crusty leather boots, too many to belong to one person, lay haphazardly near the fireplace. Sizes varied, styles from different decades. We counted at least a dozen before we stopped. That's when we realized each boot had its laces neatly tied, like their owners had just vanished. On a chipped shelf, we found a journal with mold-stained pages, half of them written in some garbled, archaic script. The English parts were disturbing enough, referencing appeasing the mountain with rituals at sunset, a phrase repeated again and again. Those who wander must feed what lies within. I couldn't tell if it was some twisted local superstition or something far worse. The final entry mentioned a necessary offering at a place called Morgan's Hollow, which as far as I knew, didn't appear on any official map. Lauren snapped photos of everything while I leafed through more pages, each scribbled with shapes that looked unsettlingly like the brand on the door. Ben found a faded photograph pinned under a splintered table leg. It showed grim-faced loggers from the early 1900s, standing in front of a cabin not unlike the one we stood in. At the very edge of the picture, a tall figure blended into the background, so faint you'd almost miss it. Except its outline didn't resemble any normal person. The longer I stared, the more it felt like the figure was staring right back. We left the cabin, unsettled and eager to keep moving. When dusk fell, we made camp near a spot that had a bit of flat ground, though it offered little comfort. I could sense everyone's nerves fraying. That night, the forest seemed alive with new noises, soft rustlings, distant murmurs, even the occasional snap like someone stepping on a branch just out of sight. Ben took first watch. I tried to doze, telling myself we'd push through tomorrow and find a real explanation. But at dawn, Neil was gone. No frantic yelling, no messy struggle, just an empty sleeping bag. His flashlight and jacket were folded neatly at his feet, as if he'd decided to get up and wander off. Lauren screamed his name, tearing at the tent flaps and sprinting in every direction. I stood there, numb, glancing at Ben, who looked both furious and helpless. We searched until our throats hurt. Footprints led maybe 20 yards into the underbrush, then vanished. It was like the ground swallowed him. Our compass spun uselessly. GPS refused to connect. Everything about the forest felt wrong, like it was warping to hide Neil's trail. Eventually, we had to accept that we'd lost him. I kept hoping he'd pop out from behind a tree with some story about chasing wildlife, but no such luck. Around midday, we stumbled onto an overgrown logging camp. Rusting saw blades lay where they'd been abandoned, the metal eaten away by time. Rotting bunkhouses leaned at impossible angles. An ancient ledger sat on a collapsed desk, the pages stiff with damp. The final entries described workers complaining of hearing low chanting right after sunset, people vanishing without a trace, and management forbidding them to discuss it. The last line read, "Evacuate as soon as possible. No one is safe here." Lauren flipped through the ledger with shaky hands. Beneath the neat columns of daily yields and supplies, we found scribbles of that same swirling emblem. She snapped a photo, then paused, like she was afraid of recording any more evidence of this place. We followed a path behind the camp that threaded between gnarled trees until we reached a cluster of smaller cabins. Each door had the same spiral burned into the wood. Inside, everything felt staged. Rusted lanterns, half-torn blankets, dusty footprints from who knows when. We saw backpacks, modern ones, heaped in a corner like cast-offs. Some had partially melted candles stuffed inside. Lauren reached to pick one up, only to recoil when she found a clump of hair stuck to the zipper. That was it for me. I told Ben and Lauren we should turn around, find an actual search and rescue team, but it was late again. The sky was a bruised purple, night creeping in faster than it should, and that's when a flicker of light appeared through the trees, like a lantern being swung back and forth. At first, I hoped it was Neil, but when we shouted his name, the light bobbed, then slowly winked out, replaced by a voice calling softly, "Neil." It wasn't his voice. It sounded stretched, distorted, like it was being forced out of a throat that didn't belong to Neil at all. A cold weight sank into my gut. We dimmed our lamps, unsure whether to follow or hide. In the end, the light flickered on again, closer this time. My mind spun with the possibilities, none of them good. With every step, a primal dread curled around my heart. I glanced at Ben, then Lauren. Neither looked ready for what might wait out there, but we couldn't just leave Neil if he was alive. I nodded, and we edged toward the light, each step feeling like it might be our last. That was the moment I realized we were no longer just trespassers on an abandoned trail. We were trespassers in something else's domain, and it knew exactly how to keep us from leaving. After that sickening call in the darkness, a distorted voice using Neil's name, I realized we were barreling toward a confrontation we never wanted. Backtracking seemed like the obvious choice, but whenever we tried to retrace our steps, the paths twisted in ways that defied reason. It felt as if the forest itself was shifting, refusing to let us go. Lauren's camera kept glitching, capturing only static or bizarre streaks of light. Meanwhile, Ben insisted we keep looking for Neil, though I could see the dread in his expression. None of us said it out loud, but we feared something had claimed Neil and was baiting us. It was like each step we took was part of a well-laid snare. We followed the flicker of that odd lantern-like glow through tangled undergrowth until we stumbled upon a wide clearing ringed by jagged stone formations. In the center stood a circle of stones marked with more of those spiral carvings, charred candles flickering in a breeze that didn't seem to touch the trees overhead. The ground within the circle felt almost electrified, like the earth itself was humming. That's when we saw him. Neil was crouched near the center, hands over his head. His posture was all wrong, like every muscle in his body had seized up. I called his name, heart hammering so hard I could practically taste metal in my mouth. He looked up, and for a split second I thought we'd found him just in time. But his eyes seemed vacant, distant. He whispered, "Don't come closer, it wants more." Lauren took a hesitant step forward, ignoring the jolt of panic that went through me. She tried to talk to Neil in a calm voice, urging him to stand, to come with us. He shook his head, lips trembling. Then he looked behind us and let out a low moan, like he was seeing something horrifying. That's when the chanting began. Not a normal voice, more like a surge of noise coming from every direction at once. It reverberated in the stones, blending with the hiss of the candles. Each syllable jabbed into my head, making it hard to think. Ben and Lauren cringed, covering their ears. I felt as if we were trespassing on some ancient ritual that was bigger than all of us combined. Before we could react, the glow around the circle intensified, each candle flaring bright green for an instant. I swear the stones themselves pulsed with an eerie light. The chanting rose higher, waves of sound warping the air so everything seemed to shimmer. Neil tried to crawl away, but his body jolted like he was hit by an unseen force. He ended up on his knees, eyes darting wildly. Ben rushed in, trying to grab Neil and yank him out of the circle. The moment he crossed that boundary, his flashlight cracked with a sharp pop, sparks flying in every direction. He cursed, staggering back while Neil clutched at the ground as though something was anchoring him. Lauren and I hovered at the edge, stomachs in knots. We could practically feel a barrier between us and Neil, some invisible line that sapped our courage each time we considered crossing it. In a sudden burst of clarity, Neil pleaded, "Break the stones! You have to break them!" We didn't understand. But we also had nothing else to go on. Candles flickered violently, the chanting hitting a fever pitch. Shadows danced on the trees, shapes that didn't match anything human. If I hadn't been so terrified, I'd have been entranced by how unnatural it all looked. Ben pivoted, locking eyes with me. Even in the gloom, I caught the message. We either try or we're done. So we rushed forward. My knees nearly buckled at the buzzing force that rippled across my body. Lauren shouted something I didn't catch, then smashed one of the upright stones with the heel of her boot. The top chunk cracked off, tumbling onto the ground. A roar, like the howl of 1,000 voices, shook the clearing. The chanting faltered, flickered, then resumed in a frantic rhythm. We kept going, toppling the carefully arranged stones, kicking aside the half-melted candles. Each time we wrecked a part of the ritual setup, the force restraining Neil seemed to loosen. He collapsed forward, gasping for breath. With one last heave, Ben shoved the largest rock out of place. It hit the ground so hard I felt the vibration in my teeth. All at once, the chanting died. The circle's glow fizzled like a dying firecracker, and the air cleared of that oppressive energy. We rushed to Neil's side, dragging him away from the center. He was in bad shape, pale and shaking, but he managed to stand with our help. "We have to leave," he rasped, voice scratchy as though he'd been yelling for hours. Lauren and I nodded, not even thinking about the direction, just wanting distance from that cursed clearing. The journey out was a blur of twisted branches that clawed at us, steep slopes that tried to send us tumbling. Yet something had changed. The forest no longer seemed eager to trap us. Maybe disabling that circle gave it no further reason to hold us. Maybe it was letting us go. By midday, we emerged near an abandoned ranger station. Even in broad daylight, the place reeked of neglect, battered windows caked with grime. Inside, we found old bulletin boards layered with decades of missing person flyers. Faces of hikers, local kids, even what looked like a family once. The pit of my stomach swirled at the realization of just how many had walked this path and never returned. In a dusty corner, pinned under a cracked coffee mug, was a map with a big red X scrawled over the region we'd just escaped. No official notes, just a single phrase in shaky handwriting. No further patrol, closed indefinitely. None of us could handle staying there. We pushed on until we reached a side road that led to the main highway. It felt surreal when we finally heard a passing car. Civilization, something I'd taken for granted my entire life, seemed like a miracle at that point. Since then, we've tried telling a few people the truth. The park officials gave us a stiff warning. They claimed we were trespassing in restricted wilderness, that we'd put ourselves at risk. They showed no interest in our proof, Lauren's pictures, that battered journal. They brushed us off, said we were confused, disoriented, that everything we found was just leftover junk from an old logging site. I'm writing this here because I'm not about to let anyone bury what happened. Neil's still pretty shaken. He doesn't remember everything, but enough nightmares bubble up to suggest it's best if we never look back. Lauren hardly goes camping anymore, says she can't sleep under the open sky without reliving those voices. Ben tries to push it down, act like it was just another mission gone sideways. But the Smokies are still there, ancient, half-forgotten corners that no one wants to talk about. The next time you see a worn trail sign with a weird symbol burned into it, or come across footprints leading nowhere, maybe consider taking another route. There are places out in these mountains that are older than any story, hungry for those who wander. We escaped, but I can't help thinking we merely interrupted whatever was lurking there. And if you ever hear chanting in the forest when you're miles off the official path, don't wait. Leave. Because whatever's left in those hollows, I doubt it cares how prepared you think you are. If you ignore the warnings, it'll only draw you deeper until you're just another lost voice in the gloom. At least we made it out, this time. I've never been one to shy away from the outdoors. Growing up, I spent weekends tramping through wooded trails, finding peace in the hush between towering oaks. So when my friend Marcus convinced me to spend a few nights in the Great Smokies, it felt like the easiest choice in the world. I should have known something wasn't quite right as soon as we stepped out of the car that morning. The trailhead, usually buzzing with the sounds of birds and chirping insects, was almost silent. We exchanged a puzzled look, but neither of us voiced our concerns. After all, we'd traveled a long way for this. We started hiking around sunrise, weaving through damp undergrowth and skirting around sprawling roots. I remember the damp scent of decaying leaves and how the forest canopy seemed denser than usual. Marcus tried cracking a joke about local legends, recounting tales of reclusive hikers who wandered off trail only to vanish forever. I let out a half-hearted chuckle, but deep down, I felt uneasy. The hush in the air was more noticeable than I cared to admit. By mid-morning, the sky had taken on a sullen cast, and a distant rumble hinted at incoming rain. Even so, we pushed forward, wanting to reach our planned campsite before the weather turned. A couple of times, I caught Marcus slowing his pace, glancing behind us as though searching for something. When I asked if he was all right, he just waved me off. Could have been a nagging sense that we weren't alone, but I tried dismissing that possibility. We'd seen no other hikers, no wildlife, not even a single deer darting through the brush. And maybe that was the problem. The absence of the usual forest life felt unnatural. Somewhere around midday, we stopped for a quick lunch on a patch of flattened grass. The silence was so absolute it made my ears ring. Every snap of a twig felt magnified, sending jitters through me despite my best effort to stay composed. Marcus asked if I heard anything, but all I could detect was the distant splashing of a creek. He admitted he couldn't pinpoint it either, just a creeping sense of being watched. We tried to ignore it, gulping down energy bars and lukewarm water before hoisting our packs again. By late afternoon, we found a semi-open clearing bordered by a narrow stream. The setting sun tinted the sky with a wan glow, turning the edges of the forest into a wall of looming shapes. We both agreed this was where we'd set up camp, even though every instinct in me wanted to keep moving. The place seemed off somehow, but we didn't have the luxury of time to find a better spot. Setting up didn't take long. I hammered in tent stakes while Marcus gathered firewood. He dropped an armful of sticks and stood there, listening intently. When I asked him what was wrong, he claimed he heard something rustling deeper in the woods, like the tread of deliberate steps, too heavy to be a rabbit or fox. My stomach churned, but I forced a laugh, suggesting maybe a deer had wandered close. Marcus shrugged, but he couldn't hide the tension in his eyes. We cooked a small dinner over a makeshift fire as dusk settled, the flames sending dancing shadows up the trunks of old trees. The moment we stopped talking, the clearing felt oppressive. I poked the fire absently, trying to force normalcy into the routine. Marcus sat rigid on a rock, scanning the perimeter for any sign of movement. Eventually, we both turned in for the night, unwilling to linger around the flickering glow. I woke up at some point, jostled from shallow sleep by Marcus whispering my name. The rain outside had started in earnest, drumming on the thin tent fabric. He sounded scared, and Marcus was never one to scare easily. His flashlight beam swayed across my tent walls, throwing strange, shifting patterns. I fumbled with the zipper, stepping into the misty darkness. The fire had gone out, and the air was cold enough to sting my face. Marcus stood near the tree line, saying something about hearing footsteps, a crunch of wet leaves circling around us. His voice was unsteady as he gestured toward the shadows. I gripped my own flashlight, scanning the area. The flicker of light revealed nothing but gleaming raindrops on foliage. No footprints, no animals, no person. Yet, the sense that we weren't alone grew stronger. Each time I swung the beam in a new direction, I expected to find someone standing there. We lingered for what felt like hours, searching with our lights. Thunder rumbled somewhere off in the distance. Eventually, we found a cluster of faint depressions in the mud near my tent, almost like footprints. But they weren't quite right. I've seen bear and deer tracks before, but these seemed too long, the pattern suggesting something else entirely. I caught Marcus's eye, and a chill settled in my gut. Without a word, we retreated to our tents, too uneasy to do anything else. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by occasional snaps or crackles in the underbrush. Dawn took its time. When the sky finally lightened, I crawled out, half expecting to see evidence of whatever lurked around us. But there was nothing except muddy leaves and a smoldering pit of soaked ash where the fire had been. Marcus looked shaken, dark rings under his eyes, his gear already half packed. We both knew we had another day or two planned out here, but neither of us felt confident about it anymore. That heavy hush still clung to the clearing, as if the forest itself had something grim it refused to reveal. I tried telling myself we were overreacting, that nights in a storm can play tricks on the mind. Yet a nagging thought wouldn't let go. If we stayed, we might discover exactly who, or what, was out there, and I wasn't sure we were ready for that. Morning light did nothing to settle our nerves. I crawled out of my tent half expecting to see muddy footprints or torn gear, but the area looked undisturbed, like the forest was mocking us with normalcy. Marcus was already awake, hunched over the remains of our soggy fire pit. He glanced up with an expression that broadcast his unease. We both knew we couldn't keep jumping at shadows, but neither of us wanted to say out loud that something felt genuinely wrong out here. We decided to break camp and press on. Our plan was to explore a bit downstream in hopes of finding a better spot, maybe somewhere more open, where the two of us wouldn't be so consumed by the sense that every shifting tree limb concealed an onlooker. We shoved our tents and cooking gear into our packs, keen to put distance between ourselves and the place where we'd spent a sleepless night. A steady drizzle followed us as we trudged along, soaking the undergrowth and turning the trail into a slick mess. The river gurgled on our left, but even that mild sound seemed too subdued. Marcus kept pausing to scan the tree line, like he expected to catch a figure darting behind a trunk. I tried focusing on practical tasks, watching where I stepped, checking the map every so often, but I couldn't stop my brain from running 100 miles an hour. After about an hour, a stale smell drifted toward us, a mix of soot and damp rot. We veered off the main trail, curious and uneasy, until we stumbled upon what used to be a campsite. Torn tent fabric lay tangled with broken poles, the colors faded and stained. Pots and pans littered the ground as though the campers fled in the middle of a meal. A half-charred log stuck out of a shallow fire pit, the ashes long cold. My chest felt tight as I tried to piece together what could have driven someone to abandon everything like this. Marcus lifted a shredded sleeping bag, its lining caked with mud. He let it drop and looked at me, horror in his eyes. The tears in the fabric were jagged, too big for simple wear and tear. I noticed rust-colored stains near the edges. We kept telling each other that maybe a bear wandered in, spooked the campers, but no footprints or claw marks indicated a typical animal encounter. Besides, the entire site felt staged in some twisted way, like whoever left it behind wanted others to see. In a corner of the campsite, half buried in soggy leaves, we found a notebook with a warped cover. Most pages were smeared or stuck together from the rain, but we could still make out occasional sentences. Someone had written about hearing voices, about glimpses of movement behind thick clusters of trees. The last entry ended abruptly. "I know I'm not alone. I just hope..." And the ink trailed off in a dark blotch. Neither of us said a word as I gently closed the notebook. The air felt heavier after that discovery, pressing in on us. Time started dragging, the drizzle turned into a downpour, and we found ourselves paranoid about the increasing gloom. It was still midday, but the clouds blotted out most of the light, making it feel closer to dusk. Every step through the mud squelched loudly, echoing our unease. We tried pushing farther along the riverbank, but our nerves were shot. Every rustle of leaves, every broken branch on the ground made us jump. A couple of times Marcus thought he saw something, like a figure darting between the trees. But whenever we shone our flashlights, nothing materialized. The forest offered no trace of a welcome. Even the low hum of the water took on a weird resonance, as if it carried whispered warnings we couldn't decipher. With daylight fading, we realized we needed another place to camp. We found a small rise near the river, where the ground wasn't quite as waterlogged. The second we dropped our packs, I regretted it. The spot was cramped and overgrown, but neither of us had the energy to keep going. We strung up a tarp, did our best to clear an area for a fire. The whole time I battled this constant suspicion that we were being watched. Darkness fell thick and fast. The wind intensified, pulling at the branches overhead like fingers scratching across bark. Marcus tried to get the fire going, but the damp wood only coughed up smoke. When we finally coaxed some flames, they were weak and feeble. We sat close, trying not to give in to panic every time the shadows twitched beyond the flickering light. We decided to pass the time by flipping through the notebook again, searching for more clues. Most of the writing was too damaged to read, but we caught references to no exits and they're always out there. The last few pages were covered in scribbled shapes, some looking like eyes or symbols. One page had a sketch of the exact same tall trees that encircled us. I think Marcus realized it too, but neither of us said a word. Eventually, exhaustion overwhelmed caution. We needed sleep, even if it meant dozing off in short bursts. Marcus offered to stay up first while I tried shutting my eyes for a while. I could hear him pacing around in the wet leaves, flashlight sweeping back and forth in a frantic pattern. My dreams, or half-dreams, featured the battered campsite and those strange drawings from the notebook. Somehow they bled into my reality, leaving me unsure whether I was actually asleep or simply delirious. When Marcus shook me awake a few hours later, his expression was grim. He whispered that he'd heard a soft thudding, like footsteps circling our camp again. We decided to both stand guard, flickering flashlights combing the dark. We didn't see anything this time, but the oppressive sensation of a presence lurking nearby made the night feel like it would never end. Hours crawled by in silence and dread. Rain hammered the tarp, and the wind whipped the branches into scraping shapes. Finally, a weak glow of dawn crept over the horizon. We could at least see beyond the circle of darkness that had imprisoned us all night. But that meant facing the reality of how deeply unsettled we were. Part of me wanted to charge back to the main trail and keep hiking until we reached the car. Yet, I couldn't shake a compulsion to figure this out, to learn what forced those other campers to abandon their belongings and vanish without a trace. Whether we liked it or not, the Great Smokies had turned hostile in a way I'd never experienced. And as I studied Marcus's weary face, I understood we were in this together. We'd either unravel the mystery of what roamed these woods, or we'd become just another story scribbled in a waterlogged notebook, left behind for some future hiker to discover. Neither of us had the luxury of a decent rest by the time morning came. We watched daybreak turn the sky from murky gray to a dull, colorless wash, and though the sun tried to break through, the forest floor remained gloomier than any place I'd ever camped. Despite our throbbing fatigue, we agreed. We'd push for the trailhead. Sticking around meant flirting with something we couldn't explain. We packed in a hurry, our soaked gear dragged at our shoulders, each strap chafing and biting into skin. Marcus's face was ashen, eyes darting with anxiety. Even so, he took the lead, swearing he'd mapped out a more direct route back. I followed, stepping around snaking roots and churned up mud. We mostly kept quiet, words felt useless. Every twig snap or distant creak of branches made us flinch. We moved fast, sloshing through patches of waterlogged ground and over thick clusters of vines. The weather eased up, but the silence weighed heavier with every mile. Usually by now, we'd hear bird calls or the rustling of small creatures. Instead, there was only the soft thump of our boots and the hush of trees looming overhead. Every so often, the path faded, forcing us to rely on a beat-up compass and soggy pages of the map. Eventually, we reached a section of trail that widened into a small clearing. A few fallen logs crisscrossed one another, and for a split second, it seemed like a good chance to rest. Marcus and I barely had time to exchange glances before something stirred on the far side, something that snapped a branch and froze our breath. My flashlight swept over the area, picking up a flicker of movement. A shape, possibly a person, hovered behind the logs. It didn't advance, but it shifted in a way that felt unnatural, like it was trying to hide yet remain close enough to watch us.
Marcus shouted, demanding whoever was there to come out. Silence answered. We could sense an uncanny awareness from that patch of forest, as if it was biding its time. Instinct told me to run, but my legs felt welded to the ground. Suddenly, the shape moved again, this time vanishing behind a crooked stump. A jolt of adrenaline tore through me, and I barked at Marcus, urging him forward. We bolted. What followed was a rush of crashing footsteps and frantic heartbeats. Roots and brambles reached out, snagging our ankles, sending us stumbling in the direction we hoped led to the road. Every so often, I caught glimpses of something weaving through the trees parallel to us, never falling behind, never drawing too close. My pulse pounded so hard I could taste iron on my tongue, but fear propelled me onward. Then the terrain shifted, turning steeper as we skirted a hillside. The undergrowth thickened, branches scraping our arms. Rain-soaked leaves glistened, forming a slick layer that made each step precarious. Marcus nearly lost his footing on a mossy log, catching himself at the last second. Whatever lurked behind us stayed hidden, yet ever present, keeping pace with no sign of fatigue. We broke through a dense section of shrubs that snagged our sleeves and packs, emerging onto a narrow dirt road. The abrupt openness felt jarring, like waking up too fast from a nightmare. For a moment we couldn't speak, our lungs clawing for air. Marcus spun around, flashlight arcing wildly at the place we'd just come from. The foliage swayed, but nothing emerged to chase us onto the road. Somehow, that made it scarier, like it was content to stay within its domain, confident we'd never dare return. A battered park ranger's pickup was parked 100 yards to our left, almost swallowed by a bend in the road. Relief surged through me at the sight. We sprinted over, dropping our packs at the ranger's feet. He looked alarmed by our disheveled state. Marcus rambled about the noises, the footprints, and the abandoned campsite, words tumbling out in a jumbled rush. The ranger's eyes hardened with concern, and he grabbed his radio, speaking low and quick about checking nearby areas for missing hikers. Neither Marcus nor I could muster more than half-coherent explanations. We just wanted off that mountain, away from whatever presence nested in those woods. The ranger gave us water and guided us into the truck. The engine's rumble felt like the sweetest sound in the world, carrying us toward safety. I glanced back through the rear window at the receding tree line, half expecting to see a silhouette peering out. If it was there, it kept out of sight. It took a while to reach the nearest ranger station. We filled out incident reports, trying to detail what we experienced. They listened carefully but offered cautious reassurance. Maybe a rogue bear, maybe even a person living off-grid. Yet as we stammered through each unsettling occurrence, it was clear something else was at play. The authorities planned a thorough sweep, though I wondered if they'd find anything, or just end up with more disturbing questions. That evening, back in the dim comfort of a borrowed bunk at the station, I couldn't rest. Everything felt unreal. Across from me, Marcus stared at the ceiling, silent. Neither of us bothered turning off the small lamp by the door. We just lay there, each lost in thoughts about the creature or being, or whatever prowled those trails. Eventually exhaustion set in, granting us a fractured peace. In the weeks that followed, we learned some gear had been found in remote sections of the forest. Scattered bags, old tents, personal items. But no definitive answers emerged. Marcus stopped talking about returning to the Great Smokies, and I haven't set foot there since. Maybe it's best if we leave those hidden pockets of land to whatever rules them. Some places, no matter how many times you explore, maintain secrets you're better off not uncovering. And yet, part of me can't fully dismiss the pull of those ancient trails. I still recall the surge of awe and excitement I felt when I was younger, forging my way through the undergrowth with a sense of wonder. But now, there's a difference. I've witnessed that the forest can harbor more than simple wildlife. Whenever folks on the internet ask about hidden corners of the Smokies, I offer the same warning. Respect them, or you might come across something that doesn't want you there and might not let you leave so easily.